Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to being able to have this conversation here. It's a keynote in a slightly different form that we're going to make here with Rebecca. So it's more like a conversation, and we're going to talk about platforms and IT modernization. So first of all, Rebecca, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
All right. So without further ado, I wanted to start by narrowing down the definition a little bit about platforms and IT modernization, and what does it mean and the relationship between them. So for example, when we talk about a platform, it can mean many different things in many different contexts. But here essentially we're talking about this idea of shrinking the time between concept to cash in software development. So many times we are only concerned about the software development process per se, but there are many other opportunities for automation around, and we call that extension platform. So it's very important to ensure evolvability of the systems at the same time. So this concept is something that for digital natives, this sounds more natural. So these companies, they are usually born having technology embedded already into the business. But we know that for in our experience here at ThoughtWorks that a relevant chunk of work is related to IT modernization. So this comes in different forms, but usually we're talking about systems that they evolve and they are developed very quickly without incorporating some good engineering practices. So when we talk about evolutionary architecture, testing strategy, CI, CD, usually they tend to accumulate too much tech debt. They reach a point where it's very hard to change because it's either too brittle, so you introduce a feature and plus 10 bugs together, or sometimes it's just hard to maintain. It's hard to read the code, and the team velocity is very slow. So I don't think this is an exclusivity of big companies with traditional systems. We see that sometimes even in startups. So I think startups have a very interesting point when they grow very fast. But after some time, when they start to scale, this is not a very well structured. They can also have the same problems of accumulating technical debt very fast. So with that context in mind, I wanted to understand, Rebecca, what is a platform and how it can help to address this kind of problem?
Well, as you said, the whole purpose of a platform is attempting to reduce the amount of time it takes to get from an idea to that idea in the hands of the end user, delivering value while reducing risk. And I'm glad you brought up the distinction between startups and enterprises, because although startups do get themselves into trouble, in general, startups are dealing with one generation of technology, processes, people's perspective, and approaches to delivering software. What we see in enterprises is you in fact have this massive range of generation 1 technology and generation 2 technology and a little bit of this over there. And what we try to do with the platforms is try to put in a set of tools and frameworks, automated processes, integrated infrastructure, all in a self-service way to make the infrastructure that underpins the applications much easier for the developers to work with. We make heavy use in these platforms of a notion called infrastructure as code, where we are trying not to have these bespoke little snowflake servers somewhere, but we have reliable ways of spinning up categories of infrastructure, and we can reliably reproduce them, and we can get them set up quickly and safely and to a known state without having to involve other parts of the organizations. We look at things as well where we can have potentially different categories of environments supporting perhaps different technology stacks or different categories of servers. But that's just the infrastructure part of the platform. when we think of platforms more broadly, and in particular, when we are trying to reduce this time of concept to cash, we also need to start to think about how do we expose the business capabilities and the business concepts that exist within our systems. And this will start to lead us to an API strategy that will give us the proper building blocks for application developers to use to deliver end user functionality. And finally, we all know the value of data, but very often you have to go through a centralized group to access data. And so another important aspect of a platform is this notion of self-service data, that as we are trying to piece together new products or new services or new ways of interacting with our clients, we can get access to the data that is relevant to the problem. And then we can surround that with standard services like telemetry and observability to allow us to really understand how the system is working in practice. What is the actual end user experience, and what is the business value that is coming out of that? And finally, the important thing to realize is a platform is still a piece of software. And so all of the things that we talk about in terms of engineering practices, testing, rapid feedback cycles, automating everything possible, pair programming, all of these different things, we want to make sure that we're following those engineering practices in the development of the platform, and then facilitating the use of the end user developers to practice good engineering practices as they are developing the application code.
Perfect. I think it makes sense. And I just wanted to expand on that. So essentially, we're talking here about automating everything that goes beyond the application itself. So we encapsulate this as a product, and the consumers are the developers, actually. So this is something very different. So the concept of developer experience comes into play. So when we see applications that need modernization, so very often we have a process that it's in place already in the company for creating an environment or creating multiple environments, depending on the case, deploying this thing into production, monitoring, creating like information radiators and these sort of things. This work, it's either manual or partially automated, but oftentimes this belongs to separate areas of the organization, so outside of the development team, or not captured in a way that is easy to replicate. So especially if we're talking about today, like I think business is changing faster than ever. So we don't know what's going to happen next year regarding to the pandemic. So we need something that allow us to move fast between different types of infrastructure and these kind of things. So I wanted to understand now, how is this connection between the platform and IT modernization?
So what we're trying to do with the creation of a platform is to position the IT organization to be a true business partner and to be able to respond quickly to what the needs of the business are as they are either responding to competitive threats or to new opportunities that may not have existed previously. And so when we think about IT modernization, we need to think about two different things. One is, how are we going to get this platform into place so that over time we have the ability to continually release new functionality? But how can we do this in such a way that we actually deliver value quickly? Because we don't want to just say, sorry, Mr. Business, I'll come back to you in 18 months when the platform's all ready to go. We can't do that. And so we need to have these parallel streams and thinking about, how can I develop a slice, use that to start to build a portion of the platform. And we use this platform to start to develop scaffolding that increasingly covers the scope of the entire business application. And along the way, we want to make sure all of these things are automated because we understand the importance for deploying quickly and safely that we get from the practices of DevOps and continuous delivery in particular. And we want to build that in from the start and provide the right kind of support And if we look at this platform properly, we can also provide the infrastructure that allows for things like canary releases to ensure that actually the release has gone smoothly. We can start to use patterns like the strangler fig pattern. It's sometimes referred to as a strangler pattern, but I have it on good authority from Martin Fowler, who named it, that it should actually be the strangler fig tree pattern. And what that pattern does is allow us to gradually wrap around the old legacy systems and providing more modern interfaces to allow for these new applications to be rapidly created. And this gives us those parallel benefits of reducing the time to value, that concept to cash cycle, but also establishing a basis on which it is easy, or as easy as possible, to respond to whatever kind of change, whether it be a business change, a customer expectation change, a regulatory change, a technology change, and also make it less risky to experiment. Because we are going into uncertain times and we need to be able to try some things out and see how our customers respond. And if we're afraid to deploy, we're not going to deploy an experiment. And we need to get to the point where it's less risky to experiment.
All right. So it's interesting for me that this is not addressing a particularly new problem. We have seen many attempts of digital transformation, and sometimes we try to avoid this word, but it's something that in a way or another, it's happening. We have departments of digital transformation within companies. And this is executed with like various degrees of success nowadays. So this type of organizational change, it's complex, takes years to succeed. It involves not only technical aspect, but also changes in like management structure, the culture of the company itself. So we have a very new situation nowadays because the pandemic is somehow forcing businesses to adapt. So in a way that like being digital, it starts to be a must-have. So if I want to survive as a business, I can go digital or I am out of the market. So how is this platform idea related to this specific scenario that we're living nowadays?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. First is, as you said, everybody needed to go digital very quickly. And the people who had systems that were ready to adapt, that had already made the move to a platform strategy, were in a much better position to spin some things up. And there's actually some real success stories of even large, what might be considered stodgy enterprises, actually getting technology out relatively quickly to provide a new channel of interaction with the pandemic. But many organizations, if they weren't there yet, they still had to move quickly. And they might indeed have introduced a lot of technical debt. The thing about the pandemic, we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know how people are going to respond as they continue to live under the different constraints on life and on business that have happened. And with that uncertainty, we have to be able to respond to whatever happens. If we were ever in a position to really be able to predict what the future was going to look like, it is certainly not now with the pandemic because of that level of uncertainty. And yet so often as technologists, we try to lay out these long-term plans of how the technology and the systems are going to evolve. And we can't do that anymore. So we should just stop trying to guess. We can use this platform thinking to provide a paved road, if you will, an easy path for people to be able to introduce even radical business changes as fast as possible and as safely as possible. This will allow us to support that culture of experimentation, which is so critical when you don't really know what the reception is going to be for something. So we want a culture of experimentation. We want self-service and empowered teams that can really own a business KPI and begin to think about what are the ways that I can add value in this new uncertain terms. and have that both business and technology monitoring in place to understand actually, have we succeeded or not? So this whole notion of what we call hypothesis-driven development. I've got an idea. We want those ideas to be as small as possible, and we want them to be measurable. And then we deploy that and see, oh, did the experiment work? It's not a very interesting experiment if you already know whether it's going to work. The whole idea of an experiment is to see what's going to happen. Sometimes the experiments fail, but hopefully we learn something. And that's why we want to both make sure the hypothesis is clear, as well as how are we going to determine whether or not that hypothesis is indeed correct. And this platform strategy and this platform thinking provides us all of this infrastructure for supporting hypothesis-driven development.
Right. And for me, it's very interesting, this idea of paved road. So this is often a term we use when referring to platform as a product. And I mean, even though this is our aim when we're doing like platform related work in our clients, many times we see some sort of a bumpy road with manual checkpoints instead. So teams responsible to provide infrastructure, they require sometimes the developers, like, they have to fill up a form with 20 questions. So I think it's a good intention to provide a service to the developers, but it's not very like designed as a product. So it's still like a centralized area that is trying to anticipate the needs of developers, capturing that as a form, as some sort of like a bureaucracy and a slow process. And I think this is a problem. So when you're in a market like we have nowadays, so your competitor might be able to put something in a fraction of the time, and you are waiting for weeks until you have something approved to go to production. And in some cases, people and central IT areas, they mandate that developers even send a drawing of their architecture in order to get approval. There's some sort of gatekeeping mechanism there. So for me, the point here is like, now that we are in like the cloud era and we're like reaching feature parity among the three big cloud providers, developers, they already know that experience. So they want the same native cloud experience when they are working within their companies. So that's a friction, because in the other hand, we had operations in general, it's shifting right with cloud, because traditional departments, like, I don't know, for example, we have like database administrators, security personnel, compliance. These things are changing now with the cloud. And I think it's very easy to, instead of providing a good developer experience, just create this layer of frustration for the developers. And so I wanted to understand basically, how can we effectively implement this notion of a paved road?
Well, and part of what's happening through this, and this is not just for platform thinking, but it's more broadly, we're having to reimagine, what does an architecture function look like? And what does it mean to have an architecture? And in the past, the target architecture for an enterprise was very often a really big architectural diagram that was sitting on a wall somewhere. But we've been championing this notion of an evolutionary architecture. And an evolutionary architecture supports guided incremental change across the multiple dimensions of our architecture. And all of those words are important. But I want to focus for a minute on that word guided, because what we are doing with an evolutionary architecture is using something called a fitness function. And this is exactly the same kind of notion that you get from optimization, from genetic algorithms, and more broadly, evolutionary computation. You have a definition of what constitutes good. And rather than using review boards and checklists and all of those things, we encapsulate within these fitness functions our definition of what are the security policies, what are the networking policies, and are these things being properly configured? We combine the self-service aspect of the platform with these fitness functions to provide that level of governance that yes, in fact, the provisioning that the developers are doing themselves do respect our policies around network security, compliance, et cetera. We have things called static fitness functions that can allow us to check things like, are we violating policies around separation of concerns? Or are we violating coding standards? But we also have dynamic fitness functions that can do things like occasionally monitor and try to probe to see, are all of the security firewall configurations correct? Are we vulnerable to particular kinds of attacks? And so we're using these fitness functions as an automated governance process that supports this notion of self-service provisioning. Part of the reason those 20 question forms exist is because that central team needed to set all of these things up. But there's, particularly in the modern world, there's no reason why that provisioning can't be automated, and we can use that combination of a self-service automated provisioning with fitness functions to provide the reassurance to the architecture team and the operations team that yes, in fact, all of their policies are being followed. And the more we automate, the more we free up the time for these specialized teams to be able to take on more complex tasks. How would we solve this problem? Because what we're trying to do violates this policy, but what we're trying to do is the right thing. So how do I sort that out? Rather than the architects and the security experts and the networking experts spending time doing mundane reviews, they can focus their times on those high value and more complex tasks.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment here. So I think this idea of paved road is great, but usually because the users are developers, they are very different from like regular users. So oftentimes we find that some developers, they really want to abstract away the infrastructure and they want to focus in developing their application. Some other times they want to actually have their hands dirty with infrastructure code and contribute with platform. So I think it's important to think in different degrees of how to deliver this. So you can either go like full abstracted, or you can have a way that developers can fork this code if they are not comfortable with infrastructure and they can start playing with it, or they can start from scratch. But in any case, you need some minimal constraints, ideally automated, things like firewall rules, networking policies, service accounts, secret management. But I think there's a risk of, when we talk about the lowest common denominator, it's very easy to encapsulate an infrastructure that is present, I don't know, in the majority of cloud providers, and is easier to change in the future. So I think especially when we talk about multi-cloud strategies, this is something that can be a trap. So how can we avoid that?
Well, it's a balancing act. When we are looking at infrastructure and empowering teams to take more control of their infrastructure, we do have to find that balance point between this lowest common denominator, as you've referred to it, or these snowflake servers where everything is minutely tuned. The reality is the cloud vendors now, for their core functionality, they do have parity roughly. Where the differences has come in some of these more specialized services. And it's not unnatural for an organization to want to provide some level of abstraction and some level of protection against lock-in. We've seen many organizations who were burned in the past by being too locked into a particular ecosystem. And so it's understandable and in fact useful to build some of these abstractions, particularly when it's not that important to the application, what the specifics of the code beneath the abstraction layer is. And so we want to, as you say, provide some mechanism that gives appropriate abstractions to development teams, but then also provides this ability to experiment. Because as you say, developer experience is really the metric that platform teams should be using. They want to delight their customers, and their customers are the developers. And one of the ways we know about doing that with end user customers is to have a feedback cycle, have a way for them to be able to get back to us about how well this is working. But the technology landscape also changes rapidly, and we can't necessarily just rely on the platform teams to be able to understand when or why a particular technology might be useful within that organizational context. So part of this feedback cycle from the end developer teams back to the platform teams needs to be this ability to have a sandbox to experiment with new features of these clouds and feed back to the platform team when these things are useful, and help the platform team understand, well, is this something where we do actually want to incorporate it into our suite of available abstractions, or perhaps something right now this is still too unique to a particular application. But that feedback loop from the development teams and giving them the ability to see, does this new cloud feature help me or not? As well as providing this suite of options so that it isn't this one size fits all abstraction. That's going to be critical to give the teams the ability to move quickly and safely. And remember, all of this is about reducing that time from concept to cache. And sometimes that means providing a standard abstraction. Sometimes that means allowing that team to experiment with some new aspect of a particular cloud vendor that might be quite suited to the particular purposes they're looking for.
Yep. Yes, I understand. And I just wanted to add something here because I think we covered a lot of this topic of delivery infrastructure related to platform. But I think we also want to expand beyond that. So one particular point that we cover is API strategy. And this is something interesting because many companies, they want to start exposing APIs, but they still don't know exactly how to leverage reusability and what does that mean. So for example, you cannot simply like spin up a API gateway, try to expose every possible service that you have under your organization because you have a very high coupling point, and this is something very difficult to change afterwards. So how is this connection between API strategy and this idea of platform?
Well, very often when we are talking about more modern architectures, one of the questions that we get is, how is this any different from SOA? And we know SOA in many ways went horribly wrong. And my feeling about that is that went wrong for two related reasons. The first is, though the contracts, the APIs that were being exposed by the producers. They were being exposed by the IT teams, and they looked at their systems and tried to say, okay, well, what are the fine-grained capabilities I can make available? A lot of what we are pushing in more modern architectures is what we call consumer-driven contracts, trying to say, this is the business capability that I need to achieve. This is the business outcome I need to achieve. Give me an API that is not focused fine-grained on the manipulation of data, but is more coarse-grained on the business capability. So we need to focus our thinking in the design of this API around what are the business concepts, what are the business flows? Because if you think about it, as we want to design new business processes and new services to provide to our customers, we're going to be thinking not in terms of, is it on SAP, is it on a Java stack. We're going to be thinking about it in terms of this is about customer account information or order tracking. And so we want to understand the boundaries, not in technical terms, but in the terms of the business language. Mm-hmm. And so our architectural decisions aren't about just what are the physical boundaries of a particular implementation, but what are the logical boundaries? What are the business boundaries between the different domains? And we can use things like these static fitness functions that I referenced earlier to help enforce those boundaries between the domains so that we don't get the wrong kind of coupling between different aspects of our system. And coupling is part of what makes systems brittle. And so we want to be able to enforce those boundaries, whether it, as I said, it might be that it's a separate system and you have a strong physical boundary in the compute sense of physical, but it may be a logical boundary, and we can still enforce those boundaries using things like static fitness functions.
Right. And I think the last dimension I wanted to cover here is when we talk about data and how to expose that. So we see that big companies, they have a competitive advantage. They have a lot of relationship with customers. They accumulate like tons of data. And many times this data is trapped. And I think when we talk about a platform, we also talk about this idea of allowing the ways to expose this data and to make data self-served to the organization. So many companies nowadays, they have like centralized data lake, some services around to collect, transform, expose the data. But how is the connection between platform and data, and what's the best way to achieve that?
Well, we can extend a lot of the basic principles of platform thinking to thinking about data. And in fact, we often talk about having a data platform. And just like the platform is a product that has the end user, the developer as the user, we want to think about data as a product as well and connect the data to the actual consumers of the data. What use would they want to make of that data? And, unfortunately, a centralized team that is just, collecting data from the entire organization doesn't necessarily have the domain knowledge to be able to expose the data in a consumable way, to be able to understand what are the kinds of insight might be coming from this data, or even something as simple as what we have to do to be able to provide the right kind of authorization or the right kind of privacy controls around the data. Very often that takes a lot more domain knowledge than is available within a centralized team. So much like we talked about the paved road in the platform, we also can start to, based on our domain knowledge, not our technical knowledge, but our business domain knowledge, provide platform access for common flows. And then to look at how different users want to use that data, and that this platform can support whatever kind of data access is required by the users. Some of them will be perfectly happy with batch. Some might have to be streaming, but we don't know that as a centralized team. We know that as a data product owner with domain expertise. And that those are the people who should be responsible for building out the data platform.
Sure. I think that the last point that I wanted to conclude here is, because all these ideas, I think they're really interesting, and they're not necessarily easy to implement or to start when you have especially big companies with their own structure and politics. So how can developers and architects influence their organizations towards this kind of thinking? Is there like a shortcut or some tips that they can use to start?
Well, in my experience, results speak louder than words. And so the important thing is to figure out, how do I demonstrate value? How can I show results as quickly as possible? So automate everything that you can to reduce the risk of deployment, to reduce the risk of releasing new functionality. and allow that increase in experimentation. There's in the Accelerator report, there are the 4 key metrics, which are related to each other. How frequently do I deploy? What is my mean time to recovery? How frequently does a deployment fail? And what is that time from concept to cache? If you try to optimize on only one of those and ignore the rest, you get yourself into problems with technical debt or with not being responsive enough. But how to start is first identify what good looks like, and then design fitness functions and information radiators to make those values visible. And then measure your progress towards those goals. And so you can start to demonstrate to the rest of the organization that things are getting better, that we're not failing as often, that we're getting things out more quickly, that our bug counts are going down, that our software quality is improving. And we want to then, as a team, as an organization proceeds on this platform journey, see how in different areas of the application estate, progress is being made in terms of increased speed. But it's important to continue to monitor and report on all of those critical indicators so that you can demonstrate to the organization that these changes have been effective, that value is being delivered, and that the organization isn't backsliding. It's that evidence that allows for the continued investment, because the organization doesn't feel like they're just throwing money at a problem and not getting any value back. So that monitoring and reporting is critical to changing the organizational mindset and bringing people along on the journey.
All right. So I think we can wrap up here with those ideas. I just received some questions from the public, so I think we can start covering them. Luckily, the 3 that I got here, they are in English, so I think it's easier for both of us to cover. I want to start with the first, that is basically saying, what patterns have you seen now with the pandemic? So what parts of the business have the most urgent need to automate or digitalize?
Well, a lot of this varies by business sector, but for retailers, the ability to support things like pick up at store, online ordering, the volume increase of people using those online platforms has been enormous. And probably one of the more common failures that we've seen are organizations that simply did not have the ability to scale rapidly enough to handle the increase in the demand. So that's one. And a second one really is people wanting to understand, what's possible. What are my options? It used to be I always did things this way. Now in the pandemic, what are the other options that I might have to achieve my particular objectives? So all of the normal patterns of behavior really have been affected, and many of the systems were just simply not in a position to be able to handle that load change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think also it's another kind of expectation. So many people, when they started the pandemic, started ordering food using Uber Eats or this kind of applications. And I see that companies, they really want to improve their customer experience, at least to a similar level. And sometimes there's no time, and people start to do partnerships with some other service. So for example, I want to use a service to do the supply chain part for me, like to pick, pack, and deliver, for example, when we talk about retail. So I think these situations are very frequent now. So people are really trying to minimize the moving parts and see what is more efficient in a short period of time. Mm-hmm. Right. So I have another one here that is, what approaches do you recommend for experimenting efficiently? Validating hypotheses about platforms seem to be time consuming, and in the current situation, time is essential.
Well, and that's where that parallel development needs to go on. We can't change reality. If you're in an organization that has brittle systems that are very difficult to change, you can't just wave a magic wand and be able to experiment quickly. But you can identify what are the parts of that application that would give me the biggest benefits for building a little bit of scaffolding over it to allow innovation to go more quickly. And so we need to think about where the current need is. What are the things that we would really like to try, but we can't because the application isn't set up to experiment. But also, where are the problems coming from? And if you use those two as your lens for how you choose to develop new scaffolding, that will provide you with the quickest path to value because you're removing the biggest obstacles that you have to the most value. So focus on both the biggest problems and the biggest opportunities and use that as your roadmap.
Yeah, and I also think that is relative. So when we say it's time consuming, because for example, I think this is a lot related to the DevOps movement when we talk about platforms and not relying on external teams. So even though we have containers today, you can still zip your application as an artifact sent to the customers with a lot of instructions. And every deployment is just a misery because you have a lot of manual processing interaction. So I think for me, the point is about doing small investments towards that direction and something that is measurable and you can justify to your business stakeholders. So I think this idea of platform sometimes is sold as like a big bang thing that is really time consuming, but I think you have a lot of different stages through the delivery and deployment process where we can start measuring and attack at different stages at different times. So I think it's possible to do that approach as well.
Exactly. It is one of those things where, sure, it might be a long time to get to the ideal state, but many of those intermediate steps can bring tremendous value. And that's true overall for things like continuous delivery, but also with platforms more broadly.
Sure. So the last one is, how do companies take this approach when they have a heritage of 80% of their budget consumed by legacy or run costs instead of growth, and would have people not prepared or without the required skills? So this combination of both things, how is it possible to succeed?
Slowly. But the thing to recognize is in organizations where they do have that 80% run cost, the whole purpose of this IT modernization and replatforming is to reduce that cost. So carve out a little bit of it, find a small problem to automate, which reduces that run cost a little bit and gives you a bit more money to invest in the next part. And the people problem is always there. Some people are going to be able to learn the new technology stack, learn the new ways of working. Some people are not. And that's the unfortunate reality. As I said, I'm sorry, my magic wand can't take care of all of those problems.
And it's funny for me, the required skills part, because like cloud computing is quite new. There's a lot of services that most people don't know. And I think it's important to identify who has interest and invest in education as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, cloud providers, they have many of them like great documentation. And if you give people a space to grow these capabilities, I think it's a gradual way to fix this problem too. Yep. All right, so I think we just reached the end. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for your time, and thank you all for watching us.
Thank you, Alexandre.